Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. It's 8:29, so a minute early. Hopefully, no one minds. Welcome to our session. It is Lessons from COVID-19 Hitting the Restart Button, Perseverance and Evolution of Academic Libraries.
So there are going to be 4 speakers, 2 from UNLV. We have Jennifer Cully, Lead Acquisitions Librarian, Corey Tucker, Head of Collections, Interlibrary Loan and Acquisitions. Then we have Matthew Buckley from Saginaw Valley State University. He's the Research and Collection Development Librarian. And I'm Melissa Maria Johnson, Reference and Subject Specialist for Social Sciences. You do the table of contents.
So our next slide here real quick. As you can see, we are covering several different areas, including acquisitions, logistics, budget and collection, development, library spaces and collections, and the future of libraries. So the way we're going to arrange it is we each talk about a specific section that we go over.
Hello, I'm Jen Cully, and I'm going to start by talking about the impact of COVID-19 on acquisitions at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas, also referred to as UNLV. Next slide, please. COVID-19 pandemic was an unprecedented event for academic libraries and librarians. The pandemic caused universities and libraries to suddenly cease in-person operations and force libraries to scramble to not only provide basic services, but to come up with creative ways to perform basic operations. The impact of closing library facilities and losing access to the workplace was very significant for back-end operations, such as acquisitions and collection management. UNLV libraries, like other academic libraries, had to adjust current workflows and processes to attempt to keep up with back-end operations and create new strategies to provide alternative access to print resources. Next slide, please. The UNLV libraries consist of Lead Library, which is the main branch, and 4 other branches: the Architecture Studies Library, the School of Medicine Library, the Music Library, and the Teacher Development and Resource Library. The UNLV library supports 12 colleges or schools and 3 professional schools. The libraries provide access to more than 1.2 million print monographs, 1.3 million electronic monographs, and over 111,600 journals and serials, and over 430 online databases. Next slide, please. The UNLV Libraries provides collections and services to over 25,000 undergraduate students, over 5,000 graduate and professional students, and more than 1,200 academic faculty. The Collections, Interlibrary Loan, and Acquisitions Department and Lead Library consist of acquisitions, collection management, collection assessment, electronic resources, and interlibrary loan. Next slide, please. When fully staffed, the current acquisitions unit consists of 4 full-time staff and 2 students. There are 2 faculty members, the lead acquisitions librarian and the electronic resources librarian, and 2 classified staff that are both library technicians. The unit went through changes impacting how many students we had, increasing the unit from 1 to 2. And we had to prepare for a staff retirement that was coming and eventually happened in September of 2021. That position was vacant until July of 2022. Staff were originally sent home in March of 2020. At that time, there was no access to print materials. All shipments for print approvals, standing orders, and print journals were paused with the big vendors, allowing them to gather in vendor warehouses until we were able to receive them. Others came in and sat on campus as there was no one to receive them. We stopped ordering physical items completely and ordered more electronic resources, even in cases where we duplicated physical items we had in the collection. An example of this process was that interlibrary loan, who would normally receive a pick book from the shelf and they would actually go retrieve the physical item, began putting in orders for ebooks instead. The electronic resources librarian worked with the head of collections, interlibrary loan, and acquisitions to get new free or purchased electronic resources set up for increased access as we lost all physical material access. Access to mail and print invoices was non-existent at this time. I worked with as many vendors as I could get the new ones, who normally sent print invoices to send them electronically. But unfortunately, all of the rest of the mail had to come in and wait until we'd been given permission to return to the library, even in a limited capacity, in order to be addressed. Most publishers and vendors worked with us as they too were beginning to work remotely. Communication with staff had been mainly by email, in person, and through in-person meetings prior to COVID-19. This changed to email, chat, virtual meetings, and phone calls when necessary as staff began to work remotely. Communication with colleagues was much the same methods as those with staff and student workers. Communication with vendors, however, switched to mostly emails, some virtual meetings, and phone calls, but they were not able to use the same chat that we use internally. All in-person visits stopped, as did in-person conferences, making the virtual meetings more important as many of them were spread across the country or the world. Next slide, please. When staff first returned to work, they were on a hybrid schedule. 1 week they would work Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and the next week they would work Tuesday and Thursday. All staff in the division were assigned to a schedule to ensure that a socially distanced environment and mask were mandatory. Eventually, all staff were able to return to full schedules, although there was an option for many to work remotely 1 or 2 days a week if their job permitted. There are several still on this type of schedule, myself included. All staff were required to take 6 furlough days without pay from January to June of 2021. Materials were quarantined when the shipments arrived and then in between each step of the process, slowing processing time down by at least a week or 2 over previous processing times. Communication methods did not change at all upon first returning to the library. Staff still heavily used email, chat, and virtual meetings. Social distancing was heavily promoted and enforced at the beginning. As staff began to return to the office, the hold on physical material shipments was removed and everything that had been sitting with the vendor arrived. Mail had continued to arrive and many bins were waiting at the library to be processed. It took staff many weeks to catch up on the backlog as time in the office was on a hybrid schedule and there were numerous furlough days that all staff had to take. All physical projects stopped when staff went home to work and continued to be on pause until staff returned full time. Several electronic-only projects were created to fill staff and student time at the beginning of the pandemic, but they were stopped as students and staff returned to the office. Ordering of physical materials resumed as the library began to have open hours for patrons, although electronic still seems to be the format of choice. As a result of changes made during the pandemic, several permanent changes will be made going forward. All procedures will be updated and in electronic format to be easily accessible off campus. While some communications have gone back to in-person, as well as a few in-person or hybrid meetings, a great deal is still done by email, chat, and virtual meetings. The advantage of the virtual meetings, such as the ability to access the library system platform and other software while in meetings for all staff, has been a huge plus and not one that staff are ready to give up. Projects that were put on hold due to the pandemic and staff being out of the office are finally resuming. One was to digitize the old paper invoices and save them in electronic format that can be viewed easily off campus. A retention schedule will be created and implemented going forward. This will also potentially free up physical space in the acquisitions unit area. Access to documents such as licenses, invoices, and statements was problematic with remote work, and all efforts will be made going forward to ensure that these are delivered electronically from the vendor and that an electronic copy will be accessible remotely in the future. Next slide, please.
Awesome. Thank you, Jen. So my name is Corey Tucker, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about the impact that the pandemic had on the UNLV Library's budget, specifically the collection budget. Just a quick question, how many people had decreased or flat budgets after COVID? Oh, yeah. All right, good. So UNLV, we did have a decrease in our collections budget. The budget for the library's collection decreased 9%. In addition, on an annual basis, we received a $400,000 serials inflation supplement, and that was also taken away as well. Because of these budget cuts, the libraries had to hold a serials and monographic cancellation project in the fall of 2020, and we cut $750,000 from the budget. So if you add the two together, we have lost about $1.1 million, so around 13% of our budget. Obviously, when you have these budget cuts, it does make you be a little bit more strategic in how you provide access to resources and build the collection. And the libraries is using a diverse set of business models, which I'll talk about in just a couple of slides, and that obviously makes dealing with the budget very, very challenging. And so another issue, kind of a domino effect, is the budget allocation. So the typical budget allocation that we had was obviously changed. So we actually increased our allocation for streaming media, for digital research collections, and for open access activities. For serials, we decreased our spending about 1% to 3%, and then we had a significant decrease in our monographic spending. So when you have all these changes, definitely your philosophy on how you collect is going to be impacted. So UNLV, before the pandemic, we were e-preferred. Coming out of COVID, we are actually mostly electronic. So as we move forward, we will probably be 96 to 97% electronic. When you have all these budget cuts and you're dealing with a lot of issues, it makes assessment even more vital. So the libraries, we're being more analytical with our usage statistics, but that's only one piece of the puzzle. So we're also gathering faculty feedback. We're gathering information related to faculty publications, citations, any kind of editorial affiliations they may have. And then we're also tracking the quality measurements related to the resources, such like the H-index, impact factor, things of that nature. So you have to put all that data together to get a good picture. And like Jen mentioned, another issue that we had was staffing. So when we returned from the lockdown, we did have a couple of open positions, and UNLV had a hiring freeze. So we could not fill those positions right away, so you have staff with extra duties, and that can be stressful for everybody. So as we kind of move along this domino effect, I'm going to be discussing the impact that the pandemic and the budget cuts had on developing the library's collection. And when I'm talking about cuts, it's not only within the libraries, but it's on campus. That does influence what happens in the library. Before the pandemic, UNLV had a ton of what we would call hybrid classes. So these classes were in person, but most of the work conducted by the students was done online within the learning management system. And so once we returned from the lockdown, UNLV continued to increase those hybrid classes. We also increased the online-only classes. So when you look at what the university is doing, this means we need more electronic resources. And an interesting change that we are experiencing is with humanities and social science users. So before the pandemic, obviously in these areas, they're pretty much print focused. But as we have emerged out of COVID, we are seeing them eagerly embrace accessing online resources. And in addition, we've had faculty in these areas request access to digital research collections, and that resulted in us allocating more funds to purchase those types of collections. So I had mentioned before about business models. So these are just a few of the business models that or say it's most of the business models that we're dealing with at this point. And so obviously that brings up a bunch of challenges for me and my department. So, when we are using these variety of business models, we're, having to track licensing terms, copyright fair use, what content we're supposed to have access to and what we have in perpetuity, and also when you're managing the MARC records within the discovery layer. So as we move along, we're seeing a major change in format and what we are collecting and what content we're collecting. So streaming media, we are seeing a huge increase with streaming media over the last 3 years. Our usage has increased 300%. Our spending on streaming media is up 40%. And so we're buying less DVDs. Everybody wants data. That data has to be online, of course. When you look at ebooks, the default model was a one-user model. As we've come out of the pandemic, we are now looking at purchasing unlimited and 3-user models, and we've actually had to look at turnaways to upgrade existing collections or purchase additional ebooks. And as I've talked about all these changes, we thought, what the heck, let's just go ahead and make even more changes. So we thought this was the appropriate time to sort of expand our support for open access. So we created an open access collection statement, which has a provision that 3% of our collections budget will go to OA activities, such as APCs, software. We are an ALMA library, so we went into the community zone and turned on all the open access collections. So those are activated. And then finally, duplication of format. Our collection development policy states that we don't duplicate things that are already in the collection. So when COVID happened, we obviously had to throw that out the window. And as we've returned from COVID, we are a little less restrictive on this. I think we need to find a balance how we move forward, but that's a major change that we've experienced.
So I'll be talking about library spaces and collections. While Jen and Corey spoke about facilitating in-house communication and new modes of collection development, my portion focuses on getting students and faculty connected to the existing and newly available online resources. Then what we saw when our library fully reopened, even with the focus still on electronic access to resources, people returned fairly quickly to our library. Please go to the next slide. A lot has to do with the type of library we are and where we're located. Being a joint use facility, we have an agreement with the Broward County Commissioners that allows anyone who lives, works, or studies in Broward County to use our academic library. We are also in what's called the South Florida Education Center, so we're surrounded by 4 other universities and colleges. So we're in a very densely populated student area. Other unique features of Nova Southeastern University is the majority of our population is graduate and or professional, and we've always had a very robust online community, online population, even before from our inception. So when we had to flip the switch and go to completely online, we had that infrastructure already built in to draw on. Next slide, please. What we saw as we transitioned to fully online was users' expectations converged with their reality. When you teach, you always caution, not everything is available online. Come to our library. But then when you can't come to our library, suddenly everything's available online. And we were working really hard to get more and more available online. So that flipped the switch in our community's minds that their expectations became reality. So Everything became available online. Publishers like Elsevier's opened their access. Organizations like JSTOR and the Hathey Trust opened up their digitized collections and holdings. In working to meet the needs of faculty and students, librarians diligently built Finding Age to connect users with online resources. Then we worked with communicating to our communities the availability of these sources. At our library, we created library guides using SpringShare's LibGuides. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. We emailed our faculty, but we stressed that these resources were available temporarily. This was not going to be reality. I think we are all seeing how that turned out. Most of us saw that usage patterns, the normal was normal in 2019, the decline in 2020. Then when everything started to open up and everything started to move to E, we started to see the upswing. And that brought a fair surge when everything started to open up in E and we transitioned. ProQuest had the move to have your print collection be duplicated in an ebook collection. We took advantage of that. A lot of universities took advantage of that. Go to the next slide, please. In acquisitions and collection development, we knew we were going to have to pay for that.
Sorry. Just a little context about some of the slides. The last slide was some of the JSTOR usage from Nova Southeastern. And this slide right here is the JSTOR usage. If you go to the next slide, thank you. At my institution, Saginaw Valley. At Saginaw Valley, a little bit of context. We only have 4 of the arts and sciences packages in JSTOR. Prior to all of this, we didn't have the huge, robust portion of JSTOR. We only had small pieces of it. And when they opened it up, as you can see here, like basically prior to COVID, like our usage was decent, but it's leaps and bounds forward since COVID has started. And it's a pretty clear indication to us, at least at my institution, of the impact, good and bad, of having access to resources that eventually probably will have to be adjusted somehow, whether we end up funding some of it or working with JSTOR or other companies to get additional access, because it clearly, the access, as you can see there, has doubled in 3 years. And the users and especially the faculty will have that expectation, and how we handle that is really going to be, again, one of the consequences of COVID going forward. And it's may not always be an easy answer for us because we may not always have the funding.
2 big trends that we've also seen are things that were freely available during the pandemic are now back behind a paywall, but they've been incorporated into the curriculum. So they're impacting our budgets. One of the culprits, I'll say their name, is Jovi. I think that we have all had experiences with Jovi. So that has impacted our budgets. The other thing is we're seeing a downtrend in our usage. If you could go to the next slide, please. So this is our ebook usage. And you see first in 2019, very high, 2020, mixed bag, and it's getting lower as we go down. It's a normalization. People were locked in one place for a while, and now we are vying with their attention again. So usage is normalized, but our budgets are being affected because we've been transitioning to access versus ownership over a specific period of time, and we've been factoring that into our budgets. But now we can't anticipate that these resources are going to be accessed because we don't have the captive audience anymore. And that's one of the things that we're seeing here in this slide. If you could go to the next slide. The good news is space. In my library, they came back. We were the only academic library open for fall 2020. fall 2021 in the South Florida Education Center for most of that academic year. So the gray line is that year, and it's trending up. So they see us as a safe space. We do have a place in our cultural memory that they go to, and it resonates, but the resources are not tied with that thought. At least that's the trend that we are seeing. So students and members of the community returned to our library when they had the chance, not for computers. These are study rooms. These are study room statistics. So when the library opened up with stringent usage, for the study rooms, they had to be cleaned in between use. Only one person could use it. All that. One person was using it all the time that they had the chance to do it. So now we're seeing a period of normalization. Our building usage is high, our material and ebook usage is down-ish. If you could go to the next slide.
And again, here's a little bit of a comparison between two institutions. So my colleague Melissa showed at Nova Southeastern some of their study room data. And on this one, you're seeing the study room and gate count for my library at Saginaw Valley essentially over the COVID years, right before COVID started and then during COVID. The study room usage is not as strong as my colleagues, but the way I look at it is considering COVID and coming back, it's been decent. Study room data is the one on the left, and while it's gone down since COVID started, that actually trends with our enrollment. Our enrollment has dropped fairly consistently the last several years. And so if you factor in enrollment decline, the study room usage has basically been negligible. Like it's been consistent year over year if you count for the fact that there's less students on campus. So the study room usage has been pretty good. If you look at our gate count, it is starting to trend up. It's a little hard to see there, but the most recent one is the green line. And so while it dipped when COVID started, it has gone back up a little bit in the last fiscal year, reflecting people are returning to our library. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the future of libraries. And specifically, my library director, I work fairly hand in hand with her, related. We're a very small operation. And what she wanted to know basically was, what are some of the impacts COVID is having on us, particularly on our collection, and what do we do about it? And I think it all kind of ties into what all my colleagues up here have been saying, both the workflows that Jen was talking about and some of the implications that Corey and Melissa were talking about, related to especially the physical materials in our building and what we do about it. It was no secret, I think, for a lot of libraries, even pre-pandemic, that we've been trending electronic. The real question is, how much do we support physical materials? And even that right now is still an open-ended question. Next slide. So just a little background about my institution, just so people are aware. Saginaw Valley is a pretty small institution. We have a student body of about 7,100 students. We consider ourselves like a regional local institution. We have about 270 faculty, full-time faculty on campus. So combined, we are under 8,000 total if you talk everybody on campus. We have over 200 databases, over 100,000 books, over 300,000 ebooks. And we're a pretty young institution. They started in the early 60s. And if you're not familiar with Michigan, Michigan is an interesting state. There's 15 public institutions in the state of Michigan. And we're one of the smaller ones. And we range in size. So we're, like I said, pretty small. But then obviously there's bigger ones like Michigan and Michigan State. Next slide. So when my library director asked me to look at what our collections were doing during COVID, one of the things I looked at was our borrowing requests. And what you're seeing is a pie chart of 3 years. Now, the larger section of the pie chart is the year before COVID. And then the two pieces that are smaller are the first 2 years of COVID. And what I was telling her basically was that, and it wasn't a total surprise, like our faculty and our students are not requesting as much as they used to, particularly when it came to book requests like ILL. Now in Michigan, we often use what's called MELCAT, which lets us lend physical books between each other. And it's dropping. And it was not a real surprise, but when you combine it with other trends that I had seen, because like prior to all of this, if I had gone back to like 2015, it was 3 times as many items were getting borrowed as what it was the year prior to COVID. So like it's a very huge drop in terms of how many items are getting asked, our faculty are asking to borrow from other places. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of it is it's electronic, and I think some of it's related to like, or they're just not using some of the materials much anymore for a variety of reasons. Next slide. One of the other things I was looking at was related to how much are they using our actual print collection. And so what you have here are 2 comparison slides of the total checkouts at 2 different institutions, both Nova and at my institution. And as you can see, and it's no real surprise, they dropped. And they've dropped pretty significantly. And I think the real question, and the question my director keeps asking me is, what's the end game basically? Like, how much do we support our print collection going forward? And that I'm not real sure on, because I just don't see us getting back to the level of even pre-COVID, both in terms of financing, because when we are cutting our budget, we often look at the monograph budget, and if it's dropped to the point where like it's half or less than half of what it used to be in terms of checking the materials out, it doesn't make sense, particularly in my case when it's a small institution where we're not a repository, we're collecting for need, like the needs of our students for their coursework. We can't be funding that. And so I had the frank conversation where I just don't believe we will ever get back to prior usage levels of our print collection. And I think one of the impacts we're seeing of COVID is I just think it expedited it. I think eventually with electronic resources, we were going to always get to a point where that's where we were trending. The buildings themselves are turning into learning commons or centers where people can congregate and study and work together, but the collections has always been trending electronic, but COVID has just expedited a process of how much are they going to use that print material. And at least the data I was showing my director is the trend is not good in terms of using the collection. But having said that, we still support it to a degree, particularly as it was related to individual projects. Like we're doing diversity audits, both of the print and electronic collections, to try to get more diverse authors into our collection. So we are doing some stuff, but it was just like, realistically, it's not a good trend. Next slide. And then I did want to at least show her, like at least electronically as a comparison, that while it was much more obvious, the trend line for print materials, to give some perspective of what our electronic resources were looking at. And what you see here is a variety of color lines of a lot of our different products, and it may be a little hard to see. The very bottom line is gate count. And what I did here was at the far left side, you're seeing like if 2019, the year before COVID, is your starting point, what is the percentage trend drop, up or down, for most of our major resources or things that we do? So the very bottom line is gate count. The second bottom to the bottom is our book checkout. So what it's basically showing you is our biggest drops were in physical checkouts and our gate count to the building. All the stuff kind of hovering in the middle is most of our electronic resources. A good chunk of them have decreased over the last 3 to 4 years, but as I had mentioned, with our enrollment drop, because our enrollment drop in the last 3 years cumulatively is around 15 to 20%, that's a pretty sizable chunk of students to lose and not have it impact some of our usage. But it's maintaining its own. So like the stuff you're seeing in the center, things like ProQuest, EBSCO, that kind of stuff. And if you're wondering, that very top line is Canopy. And you're wondering, well, why did it drop so significantly in the last year or two? It's because we mediated it. And so because we mediated it, its usage did drop significantly. But that gave her at least a little bit of perspective electronically of what we were seeing, where our electronic resources were stabilized. Things that were related to either physical materials or coming into the building did have a very significant fall off. And the real question is, at least going forward, what does it look like for us? Next slide.
If I could chime in, we're seeing the same things too, and I think the future is going to deal with discoverability. If everything is moving online, we have to make it discoverable for our communities, and that's going to be a challenge with the different platforms. I think we're all going to see that.
And again, these are just some final thoughts. Obviously, we're seeing a variety of the areas and the libraries are impacted by the pandemic. Library staff have had to adapt to a new work environment, and communication among staff is vital to the success of implementing any new workflows or processes. Many academic libraries are battling flat and decreased budgets, so libraries have to adapt and be strategic when building their collections. This is what we're seeing with Melissa's data, that although we've been significantly impacted, when it comes to libraries of space, things are normalizing, and libraries are still considered an integral part of the institution. And we're just not seeing, even at UNLV, not seeing the usage of the space drop off. It's actually gaining steam. And then somewhat of, like I said, and what Matthew brought up, is that we are seeing light at the end of the tunnel, but usage and borrowing of physical materials has been decreasing and still is. And so what is going to happen with print resources the next 5 to 10 years? Will we see print become a thing of the past? Who knows? So with that, just a credit to our slide and questions.
And I'll say I've got the microphone here, so if you raise your hand, with questions, I'll be happy to bring the microphone over.
Or if you even just have a comment.
Thank you for that. That was all really interesting. Do any of you have any awesome, positive workflow changes that occurred that you are so glad you will never go back to the old way of doing it, that occurred because of the pandemic?
I guess I'll start. It relates to our meetings and how we coordinate stuff. Like in terms of our collection development, it's a lot easier to do it electronically in terms of workflows. One thing we've lamented at our place is that they haven't been as flexible, the university, at work from home or a flexible hybrid environment. And our supervisors are as flexible as they can be under the current policy, but I do think that that's where we're headed. Our university's having new leadership changes, and I do think you're going to see more libraries, including mine, become a more hybrid type model in terms of our work environment, where I don't know if we're always going to be in the building as much anymore. And being able to, and that's where we're related to the electronic side. I just think it will be a lot easier if most of the collection is electronic to do your work, because we can all carry our iPad or laptop almost anywhere and do our work. And unfortunately, my library is not quite as progressive as some. Go ahead.
Along that same line, I'm more back end, so I'm looking at our processes. So getting invoices away from the postal service and through email. We've got some kind of growing pains with that because now the volume coming in is immense. But moving that to some type of electronic format so that we can process and then save it has been great for access off campus. We did not have procedures that were all electronic, and we were trying to do training remotely, through some of this process as well. So having all of that easily accessible is kind of where we're going in the future. So I see that not just the electronic resources, but that back end process going electronic there too is kind of where we're going. And we're not going to go back to all the print invoices. It's too cumbersome, and we were losing the print or not getting them in the mail, or things were delayed. And I think this is going to help us going forward.
So I'm with Matt. I don't have the ability to do a hybrid work environment. And the best thing that came up for me as a liaison is my faculty started to lean on me a lot more. And I appreciate that because they saw our value more in what we could contribute to their classes when they had to go completely online. And sometimes it was out of our purview because it was the actual Canvas environment or a tech issue, but that gave me an inroad to be able to, lead them to other resources. So that was a really good thing, and it led to a really strong relationship with my faculty.
And, Jen is in my department, so she's done the bulk of the work, but in those processes. But I have to say 2 observations coming out of it. One, I feel that our processes are actually more efficient. And I also think, probably most importantly, that communication within the department, I think, improved as a result of the pandemic. So, to me, communication is key, and I feel the department is doing much better in that area.
Any other? Okay, one more question.
Sorry, you were saying that invoices from the post office coming in is kind of a thing of the past. How would you, I know you're going to receive them electronically, but because I'm thinking your inboxes have got to get filled up as well, so that's making it challenging for you also. So for your various resources that you are purchasing, would it be better to have your invoices in, say, the vendors' portals or something like that, so that now you can always go back to them? What are your thoughts on how to better manage those invoices as they're coming in? It's a question for me.
Yeah, we have a shared email for all the people in my area. So there's 4 of us in my area, and 3 of us have access to this email. And so we have the invoices coming in, and we're putting them on a spreadsheet to make sure that we don't miss them when we're actually processing them. And then we've got folders that we keep them in electronically that's in a shared space. Yes, I mean, there may be a better way to do it, but I was 5 months into the job when we got sent home. So, trying to adjust spur of the moment while I'm still learning was a little challenging. And we only have moved over the big vendors. So some of the smaller ones, we really don't have control over those coming in. Because we've got, a multi-million-dollar budget. So using multiple platforms to go find them for us really wasn't going to work because there were too many places to potentially go and look. So yeah, unfortunately we're using, Excel to keep up with things. But I think for us, that's been helping. And then to have that shared email, so you also have shared responsibility. And that's what that email is for. It's for orders, it's for invoices. So it's not really directly going into our personal mailboxes, because I think that's where we're going to lose things. So just funneling it in that direction.
And just to jump in, it's even though there changes have been made, we're always looking for efficiencies. So, these changes are not set in stone moving forward, always trying to tweak things here and there.
Okay. I don't see any other hands, and we are basically at time, so thank you. Appreciate this.